Welcome back into Live Now from Fox, where we continue to keep watch of all of the major news stories from this week and looking ahead to some major headlines that we are expecting as well. We're taking a look here over at the New York City skyline because I want to turn our attention now to the latest when it comes to New York City's mayoral race, which continues to heat up. And I want to get a full breakdown of all of these candidates that are still in the running. To do that, joining me now is political analyst and historian Rich Rubino. Rich, always good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
I want you to start, Rich, because you have been watching this very closely, and we're talking about a mayoral race. This is not something like when we see a presidential campaign, but still, this is making so many headlines across the country with a lot of eyes on it, including President Trump. Why is that?
Well, I think New York's obviously the biggest metropolis in the country, and I think that Donald Trump, it's his former home city, but also he very much does not want Mr. Mandani, who is currently the Democratic nominee to become mayor of New York. It's interesting, Andrew Cuomo, who was once an arch nemesis of Donald Trump has now very much become somewhat of an ally of him and is doing everything he possibly can. That is to try to make it so that Mr. Mandani, Zoran Mandani, does not become the mayor of New York City.
I'm going to bring up here some of the footage just to break it down for our viewers if they don't know too much about these candidates. So we have three of them still in the running, and you do see them pictured on your screen. We have the Democratic candidate, Zoran Mamdani, which you spoke of briefly there in the intro, independent candidate, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, and then Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa. Rich, let's start with Zoran Mamdani. There's a lot to know about him.
Yeah.
What is some of his background? Before we get into some of his policies, give us a bit of an overview.
Well, he's a member of the state legislature. He comes from a very Christian background. In terms of some of the controversies, basically is that he's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and they're part of the Democratic Party in many respects. But I think that many members of the establishment Democratic Party are very much adversarial toward the Democratic Socialists of America. AOC, for example, was somebody who got elected, and she got elected in a very similar fashion, actually defeating the incumbent member of Congress at the time, Joe Crowley, in a district in New York City, and landed up winning that seat. And I think that this is very similar. I think in the Democratic primary, you had Andrew Cuomo, who was very much the establishment candidate. There were other candidates as well, but he's very much the establishment candidate and the early front runner. And just like AOC, Zoran Mandani was very much underestimated. Polls showed him in single digits at the beginning, but he really appealed to the left-wing base of the Democratic Party, which feels that the more moderate wing is not hospitable toward them. And he had one of the biggest upsets in history of the Republic, really. And he landed up winning. He's still a member of the state legislature. He's worked with Chuck Schumer, for example, even though Chuck Schumer hasn't endorsed him. They've worked together on trying to help cabbies in New York City, for example. But he's very much unknown, I think, or he was unknown to many parts of the establishment of New York City, and now he's become the Democratic nominee. Consequently, you have a really interesting scenario where Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, for example, Gregory Meeks, who represent districts in New York City, have not endorsed him. Usually it's pretty much pro forma that the members of the establishment of the Democratic Party will support their party's nominee, because his ideology is so much contradistinction to the Democratic Party, the establishment of the party. You see some members of the Democratic establishment being very incredulous in terms of endorsing him.
And then, Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I hear the term Zoran Mamdani, I'm also heard the terms Democratic Socialist.
Yes.
Could you explain to our viewers exactly what that means, and if his policies or this approach that he's taking is comparable to maybe past candidates or lawmakers that we have seen?
Well, I think it's interesting. In the United States, unlike other countries, the word socialist is very much seen as unpositive. It's very much seen as a derogatory term, if you will. Socialists do not succeed in the United States in terms of being elected. Other countries, they have socialist parties that are major parties. In the United States, there are socialist parties. There's the Socialist Parties USA, for example, but they do sometimes nominate candidates for president, but they very rarely succeed in actually representing and actually getting somebody elected to an office. Victor Berga, for example, in the 1930s, represented a district in Wisconsin that was very much kind of sui generis, if you will. Bernie Sanders really kind of put it on the map in the United States. Bernie Sanders was somebody who came into politics running as a third party candidate. He actually ran at first against Patrick Leahy, who was the incumbent Democratic candidate. But gradually, Bernie Sanders went from being a socialist to at least being tacitly a Democrat. He's still technically a independent. He identifies as somebody who's part of the Democratic Socialists, but he caucuses with the Democrats. Now, what does that mean? Well, in order for a party to have a majority, in order for a party to seat somebody on the committee, they have to caucus with a certain party. So Angus King, for example, in Maine, is an independent, but he caucuses with the Democrats. The Democrats give him committee seats. He meets in the Democratic caucus. It's very similar with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is not technically a Democrat, but the Democratic Party, because they want the majority, they're willing to basically caucus with him, or because rather they would like to be in the majority and they want as many seats as possible. They caucus with him. They give him committee seats. He's actually currently the ranking member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, for example. So that's basically what it is. It's basically a more liberal version of the Democratic Party, but it's a socialist party that says that they're not authoritarian. Some believe that the Socialist Party, generally speaking, socialism can go toward authoritarianism. They believe in the democratic process. They believe in elections, for example. So that's really where they're kind of different. I think that many people who are kind of very much pure, unadulterated socialists would say that the democratic socialists are not real socialists. Even AOC has had a lot of criticism in the past, in part because of her support for Vice President Harris last time around over the third party candidates like Jill Stein of the Green Party, that some Democrat and socialists have actually kind of disassociated itself with even her.
And then one final question when it has to do with Mamdani and tying it into President Trump and how he has been adamant and very vocal about the fact that he does not want him to be elected. If you had to narrow down maybe like a couple of bullet points as to why exactly the president says not Mamdani, what would those be?
Well, I think the first thing is that Donald Trump is very much the antithesis of socialism. Although some of his policies, you could argue perhaps tariffs, are something that's not really necessarily conservative. I think that he believes that he is very much anti-socialist. He's a businessman. Many of his coefficients in the business community are very incredulous toward Mr. Mamdani, because they believe that one thing he wants to do is he wants to increase taxes on the rich. They believe that that means that many part of the New York City's business community might flee New York, might go down to states like Florida, for example. So that's really, I think, where his criticism comes from. Well, what he actually thinks from a political perspective, it might actually, from a pure, cold, calculated Machiavellian political perspective here, it might actually be to his political benefit, because what he can do is he can try to alligate or tether Democrats in other parts of the country to Mamdani. He can say that a Democrat running for, a House seat in California, in Orange County, in a more moderate part of the country, for example, well, he's in the same party as Mamdani. So does that mean that you endorse Mamdani? So I think from his political perspective, he might actually might actually benefit him, because the Socialist Party, socialist candidates, generally speaking, do not succeed in the United States. And when they do succeed, they're very much tethered to the rest of the party, and the other members of the party have to really have some wiggle room. On the one hand, they don't want to alienate their base, but contrary-wise, they don't want to be seen as a socialist in the United States.
And I do believe it was a few days or weeks ago, I think, that President Trump had posted something saying that if Mamdani were to be elected, it would be the best thing that would happen to the
Yeah.
Republican Party. A couple more candidates, though, to talk about, Rich, before I let you go. So let's move on to the independent candidate,
Yeah.
former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who President Trump has actually backed. This would be maybe his pick if he was going to be moving forward. Tell us a little bit more about him. Of course, he was the former governor of New York, but he was tied into some scandals.
Yeah, he was, of course, the son of Mario Cuomo, who served for 3 terms as governor of New York, who was an early front runner for president in 1991. Andrew Cuomo was very popular when he was governor of New York, at least for most of COVID, when he was having his press conference. Later, there were a few scandals involving, for example, involving the care for those in nursing homes, for example. Andrew Cuomo eventually had to resign his seat as governor, and he ran for mayor of New York City, which you could argue is either a downgrade or an upgrade. In many respects, it might be an upgrade because the New York City mayor is a very obviously a very stressful position, but it's obviously you don't have as many constituents. You're not, for example, responsible for voters, and you're not responsible for the rest of the state in terms of some of the rural areas, some of the small cities like Watertown or Endicott or Binghamton. You're just responsible for the 9 million denizens of New York City, if you will. He ran in the Democratic primary. He was very much the establishment candidate. I think many believe that this was pretty much his to lose. It was almost a pro forma primary. But then Mr. Mandani really caught fire, and eventually you had a scenario where Bill Clinton on the last day had to actually had to make phone calls in New York City, robocalls it is, telling New York Democrats to come out for Andrew Cuomo. The establishment tried to come together and do everything they could to get him elected, but he ended up losing by 13 points in what was really one of the biggest New York City mayoral upsets, probably, certainly in the history of the city. And Mr. Mandani landed up winning. So what did Andrew Cuomo did? He did something that's been done a couple times in history. Joe Lieberman did this in 2006, for example, when he ran in the primary and lost to Ned Lamont, who's the current governor of Connecticut. And Ned Lamont won the primary for the Democratic Party, but Joe Lieberman actually got signatures to run in what was called the Connecticut for Lieberman Party. And then they didn't have a primary, obviously, but Joe Lieberman landed up actually winning that race in a three-way race, three major candidates, the Republican, Ned Lamont, and Joe Lieberman. So it's something that has been done before. He's very much, I guess he's somewhat disavowed his support from the Democratic Party, but I mean, rather as being a Democrat, but he still has some support from moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, independents in places like Staten Island, for example. So he's trying to win this as not being a Democrat, but having kind of Democratic or at least moderate Democratic policies.
It's interesting that you say that Cuomo is trying to have these moderate Democratic policies, and yet still President Trump is backing him pretty much
Yeah.
when it comes to this entire race. So why is it that the president would go with someone who's a bit more of a moderate Democrat? He's running as independent when the president is a Republican.
Yeah, politics is very much it makes for strange bedfellows. He sees the Republican nominee as somebody who can't win, somebody who's in the race but does not have a realistic chance of actually winning. He wants somebody. It's kind of like pick your poison. I don't think he's necessarily a supporter of Mr. Cuomo, but he wants somebody other than Mandani, and it's more or less. I think he believes of the two candidates who have a chance of winning in this race, he believes that he's the lesser of two evils. So consequently, Mr. Cuomo, who's someone who has been an adversary of Donald Trump in the past, maybe an adversary again in the future. I think that he believes that he is the lesser of two evils. That's why at least he's not publicly necessarily doing anything to campaign for Mr. Cuomo. Donald Trump is extremely unpopular in the boroughs of New York City, except with the possible exception where he's a little bit more popular in Staten Island, the more kind of conservative part of New York City. But he certainly is doing everything, at least privately, to make sure that Andrew Cuomo ends up being victorious.
And I think that that is the perfect segue to head to the final candidate in this race. Three of
Yep.
them currently still running. So then we have the Republican candidate, Curtis Lewa, who you did just mention President Trump not really too keen on believing that he could win this race. But talk to us about Curtis Lewa. Who is he? What is his background?
He's a talk show host. He was part of a group that tried to kind of do everything they can to protect the citizens against crime in New York City in the past. He's someone who's very much a conservative Republican. He's more conservative than I think Republicans that get elected in New York City. Rudy Giuliani defeated David Dinkins, for example, back in 1993, basically running as very much of a moderate. He was succeeded by Michael Bloomberg, who was a former Democrat who actually started a Democratic primary and figured he couldn't win in the Democratic Party, so consequently he ran in the Republican primary as well. Mr. Swilwa is very much a Republican, and he's very much more of a national Republican, if you will. He's somebody who's been a radio talk show host, for example. So I think that most people believe that if anything in the race, he's more or less a spoiler. I think that Donald Trump was very happy probably to get Eric Adams, the current mayor, out of the race. Eric Adams is someone who potentially could split the vote between the other three major candidates. Now I think he wants Mr. Silva out of the race as well, and he wants it to be a two-man race between Andrew Cuomo and Zoran Mandani, but he's somebody who I don't think is going to be aggressing from the race anytime soon. He's basically made that categorically, explicitly clear. So we'll see what he does potentially toward the end of the campaign. But right now, it looks like he's staying in full throttle.
I want you to elaborate on something you pointed out within that last answer, where you called Sliwa a national Republican. What do you mean by that?
I mean, his policy, he's somebody who does not kind of shy away from the Republican label. He says he's a Republican, for example. Usually when you're running for mayor of New York, or when you're running doing anything in New York City, or any more Democratic or liberal enclaves, and you're a Republican, you do everything you possibly can to distance yourself from the Republican Party. You say, I'm here to be independent minded. I'm here to work with both sides. You never actually mention that your party registration. But I think that the current Republican nominee sees himself as a Republican, and he's very much proud and unreserved, if you will, as a Republican. And that's something that doesn't necessarily play well in New York City. It's something that might play well in more conservative parts of the country. But in New York City, the only way Republicans can get elected as mayor is basically running as a progressive type of a Republican, the way Rudy Giuliani did, the way Michael Bloomberg did, the way John Lindsay did back in the 1960s. As a matter of fact, John Lindsay is landed up eventually becoming the candidate of the Liberal Party, because they had and they have what's called fusion voting in New York City, meaning that you can be run on different parties, different primaries for different parties. And at one point, he didn't get the Republican nomination, but he got the Liberal Party nomination because the Republican Party was so liberal at the time that you could actually get the Liberal Party nomination as a Republican.
And then, Rich, before I let you go, and this may be a little bit difficult to answer, but we are less than a month away from this mayoral election there in New York City. I'm going to put back up here the photos and the names of those three candidates. If you had to, give maybe even a one-liner synopsis as to what each of these candidates would stand for, what kind of candidate they're running as, what would you say? And let's start with Mamdani.
Mandani, I would say, dramatic transmogrificational change in the New York City, in the body politics of New York City. He does not want traditional kind of moderate Democratic policies on the edges, triangulation. He wants policies that are very much that will very much change the outlook of New York City. For example, he wants government-owned grocery stores. That is something that very few Democrats, establishment Democrats, have entertained as an idea. Consequently, because he is so far to the left, you have a very interesting scenario that Hakeem Jeffries, who represents the 4th District in New York City, normally would support the the Democratic nominee for pretty much any office. He has not made an endorsement yet because he knows that he's very much afraid that if he makes this endorsement and he's seen as a socialist, that it'd be hard for him to go around the country campaigning for other Democrats when they say, why did you support a socialist for mayor of New York? Consequently, he has not made an endorsement. This may mean that there may be a primary challenge for him. I think the Democratic Socialists of America are enraged he hasn't made an endorsement, and they might put a candidate up against him, which would mean that he's going to have to spend a lot of more time in his district campaigning for re-election. The same with Congressman Gregory Meeks, for example. So that's really where he is ideologically. The Democratic Party really is kind of confused about what to do here. You have other members of the Democratic Party, the governor, for example, some other members of the congressional delegation who are more establishment that have kind of decided they're going to endorse him. But obviously it can be a very dangerous and precarious situation for Democrats on whether they make the endorsement or don't make the endorsement. In terms of Andrew Cuomo, he's obviously a former governor. He's somebody who's very much an establishment member of the Democratic Party. He was someone who was very popular toward the beginning of his term as governor. He's also a former HUD secretary in the Clinton administration. He came in that position when he was just 39 years old. I think at one point there were some who were saying, because of the way he had handled COVID early in 2020, that potentially he could be a Democratic candidate at some point. Some were even saying that Joe Biden should step aside in 2024 and Andrew Cuomo should supplant him as the Democratic Party's front runner. But then the scandals came and he landed up becoming very unpopular and eventually had to resign his seat. Now he's running for mayor of New York. And then Curtis Silva, he's very much a conservative Republican. He's a talk show host. He's not somebody who really has elective office experience, but he's someone that has kind of a cult following, I think, with conservatives, the conservative movement in New York City. I think the places he should do well, I think you might look at a place like Staten Island, which is the fifth borough of New York, which is very much more conservative, if you will, than the rest of the city. That's where he should do well. I think you can see in the other boroughs, it'd be very hard for people to vote for a conservative Republican. Simply, just like, for example, it would be very hard for folks in Provo, Utah, to vote for a liberal Democrat. It's very much the demographics are just not there. And I think Donald Trump knows from a Machiavellian, cold, calculated standpoint that the best possible solution he can have for not having a socialist party, a socialist or an avowed socialist as the mayor of New York, is to have Andrew Cuomo, who's more or less a center-left, moderate establishment type or style of Democrat.
All right, Rich Rubino, a political analyst and historian. A pretty good breakdown there. Three candidates there running to be a mayor of New York City. It's one that a lot are watching, and we're going to keep track of it. And of course, we'll be checking in with you to see what is going to be the shakeup possibly within these next couple of weeks. Rich, thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Of course. We do want to step away for a quick commercial break here, taking you out to the live image that we have.